me again. Thank you for joining me in my studio on a Wednesday for another look at some fun things from the studio. And today we're going to continue our celebration of 40 years of Warhammer Fantasy Battle by looking at the second volume in my Encyclopaedia Warhammica. This is entitled Plothammer. Don't know if you can see this in the corner here, for a reason that will become apparent later on. So let's dive into the pages of the second edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So this is from 1980, not 1983, because that's the first edition we looked at last time. I believe this is 1984. Yes, 1984. So there you go. Year of my birth. This came out. Obviously, I was not playing it then, but I have played it since. Let's have a look at the rules. Okay, here we are. Now, before we start, this is going to be a rather cursory run through because look, we've got a lot of stuff to look at, and I'm only going to do this for maybe 20 minutes. So we've got a lot to look at. If you want to go through this and the first edition Warhammer, and I think they're going to go further, but if you want to take it slow and go through it in more detail, I can recommend the Forces of Fantasy podcast on Spotify or other podcast platforms. Look that up. They're also celebrating 40 years of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and are going through this in a lot more depth and a lot slower. I'm just going to show you an overview really quickly and marvel at how pretty it looks, and maybe talk a bit about some of the rules specifics and the contents that's in here. So you will notice that we have a map. The Red River Valley does not appear on this map, but for the first time now we have a concept of the Warhammer world. This is not the first Warhammer map though. I will go into more detail about that when we find it in the book. You will notice this is actually the front page, or the front piece, from 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, not from 2nd edition. You can see the logo there, and it's got little bits of the Armies book appearing through it. The reason is this is the front piece, or the end pages, from my original 3rd edition Warhammer rulebook, which I rebound, and you will see in the next edition of this series. It's got nice marbled end pages, but I didn't want to get rid of this because this has got signature from the lovely Brian Ansell on the front cover. So I wanted to keep this and use this, so I thought I would use this in the 2nd edition book instead. But here we are. So this is a three short pamphlets stapled in a box that have become now bound into one book, but initially three sections. So this is Book 1, Combat, making no question here that this is a war game. The first is Combat, and it deals with all of the basic rules and the advanced rules for fighting fantasy battle games. Talks about scales, talks about how you can play it in different scales if you want to, which is nice. And look at this beautiful John Blanche piece. There's so much stuff going on in there straight off. It's very much intended to be used with a games master, with somebody who's running the game. Remember, this is coming from fantasy roleplay, where you've got somebody running the game. The intention is that you still have somebody who's controlling the scenario, but they play much lesser of a role in this than they do in the 1st edition. Discussions of some scenery. This is not really changed. These elements didn't really change much all the way through Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Exact definitions of what they did change slightly, but not an awful lot. The characteristics. Basic characteristics are the same as in 1st edition, so you've got movement, weapon skill, bow skill still, strength, toughness, wounds, initiative and attacks. And then you've got this set of personal characteristics. So this was dealt with in the second part of 1st edition, the kind of roleplay part. Now this has become, excuse me, this has become part of the essential core rules: leadership, intelligence, cool, and willpower. So you've still got those 4 separate categories, and we'll go into what they do as we find it a bit later on. Discussion of bases. 20 by 20 is standard for infantry, 25 by 50 is standard for cavalry, so plastic base sized. But it says basically you should use a base that represents the size that the model would need as a minimum fighting space that looks right. So although it does define the standard size of bases, there's nothing that says in here that you can't adjust as necessary if your model looks really stupid on a 20 by 20. For example, it says orcs and things are better on 25 by 25. You make your bases bigger to suit. Discussion of round bases here, how the difficulty with round bases is not knowing who's fighting who. I've never found that to be a problem with round bases, but there you go, some people do. But they say that you can use round bases if you want. So still, I don't know, base lawyers, there's still some flexibility here. We've got the turn phase. In this case, we've got movement, then shooting, then hand to hand, then reserves, then magic, then rallying. Difference from the first edition is that all of this, you can only do it if it's your turn, except for fighting in hand-to-hand combat, where both sides get to fight. So you remember in the first edition, both sides could shoot and both sides could test to rally routed troops in every turn. In this case, everything you do only in your own turn, except for fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Movement hasn't changed. There's a bit more here on formations, changing formations, wheeling, changing facing, moving through, adding ranks, subtracting ranks. Shooting, again, hasn't changed, but there's a bit more clarity. You can shoot only to your front arc, apart from if you're mounted. If you're mounted, you're limited to shooting at short range. You get a weapons breakdown here, which is handy. Interesting to see that your elf bow here is exactly the same profile as a crossbow. I don't think they made crossbow stand and shoot weapon in this, but I'll have a look later on. That might be what the distinguishing difference is. But ballistic skill 3, you're hitting on a 4. Sorry, bow skill 3, you're hitting on a 4. Bow skill 4, you're hitting on a 3. Bow skill 2, you're hitting on a 5, and so on and so forth. And then some modifiers, not too very different, but the to wound chart has changed. So now, if your strength and toughness are the same, it's 4s all the way down. If there's 1 point of difference, if you're 1 point higher, it's 3s all the way down. If you're 1 point lower, it's 5s all the way down, and then the rest of the chart is 2s and 6s, or there are some instances where you can't hurt at all. So whereas the last chart in first edition was quite mixed, there was no regular pattern, this is a much more ordered pattern. Not much need to consult this chart once you've learned what the pattern is, apart from knowing that if you're strength 1 you can't hit anything that's toughness 5, and so on and so forth. Saving throws, again, haven't really changed. Yes, there you go. That's the difference. Troops armed with crossbows may not move and fire during the same turn, so that is the difference between a crossbow and an elf bow in technical terms. Combat charging is a double move. Models can stand and shoot, they can stand and receive, or they can flee a whole charge move, so it's not just back off, it's a whole charge move away, so you're very likely to be able to flee away from an enemy, but obviously if you're too close to your table edge, bye-bye, you're off there. The to hit chart here is still, if you're even, you're still looking for 5s. If you're 1 or 2 lower, 1 or 2 better, then you're looking for 4s, then 3s, then 2s. If you are 1 worse, you're looking for 6s straight away, and then 7s, 8s, which you could roll a d6 and then roll a 4, or they're modified by whether you charge, for example, whether you're uphill, whether you're following up, whether you're confused, whether you're crossing a defended obstacle, whether you're fighting a feared opponent, and so on and so forth. Modifies it so it can get you down to values, but that still means hitting on a 5, it still means you're not likely to do a great deal of damage in combat. The to wound chart is the same, the saving throws result is the same. Combat results are entirely based on wounds. There's no standard bonus, there's no rank bonus, nothing else. It's all to do with how much damage you deal in your fight. So you do want to, take advantage of your +1 for charging attack, because at least that gives you a 50-50 chance of hitting, and it means that you're likely to cause more damage and break an enemy on the charge, which I guess is what they were going for. But if it does end up being a protracted engagement, it's not so easy to get out of, even as first edition, because first edition, if you lose a combat and you're pushed back a number of times, there's an auto break after you've been pushed back so many times. In this edition, pushbacks happen. You're rolling a leadership check, so you're rolling on leadership modified by the number of wounds that you suffered different from your opponent. So if you inflicted 4 and your opponent inflicted 6, that's a difference of 2, so you're taking a leadership test at -2. So that means that the more casualties you take, obviously the more chance you're going to have of breaking, but there's no and they continue to get a bonus for pushing back, so there's things built into it to make it a benefit for pushing people back, but there's no auto break. However, you do have to take a route test at other points. You have to take a route test if you just lost a quarter of your troops of its original value. Obviously the more troops you're losing, the more route tests you're taking, the more possibilities you've got of fleeing. But there's no guaranteed route. Stuff can take some time to break off. So you can be tied in combat for quite some considerable time. Psychology, you've got stupidity, frenzy, panic, terror, fear and hatred, and they're mostly a test on the cool characteristic. Stupidity is a test on intelligence, everything else is a test on cool. Then you're through to advanced rules, working out point systems, and this extreme creature here is quite a funky example. He's got weapon skill 10, strength 10, toughness 10, wounds 100, initiative 10, attacks 100, leadership 10, intelligence 10, cool 10, willpower 10, but no shooting value, and he can't move, so you just stay away from him and pelt him with stuff, and hopefully eventually he goes down. But they were using this as an example to say, essentially, it's all up in the air how much you point stuff from. There's no hard and fast calculator. You've got to go with what works the majority of the time. And so there's a system here for working out points values based on what works the majority of the time, adding arms and armour and mounts, and then here's a basic breakdown for regular creatures. And you'll see that the regular standard profile 4 3 3 3 3 1 3 1 7 7 7 7 7 didn't change all the way through. That's still a regular human profile. Humans are distinctly average in Warhammer, and gives you a points value of 5, from which all of these other races are worked out points wise. Leaders give you a bonus to your psychology rolls. Standards give you just +1 to your leadership, so they don't help you maneuver, but they do mean that if you push back a unit which has a standard in it, you can attempt to capture the standard, and then you get bonuses for having their standard. Musicians just help you to maneuver, they make it slightly cheaper. You lose less movement rate doing manoeuvring. Champions and heroes. Weapons, you can see we've still got Goblin Fanatics in here. So double-handed weapons give you -1 to initiative, +1 to wound, and -1 to armor saves. Spears give you +1 to initiative and +1 to hit against troops attacking from the air. And then you've got nets, balls and chains, pikes, improvised weapons, knives, spears, lances. Skirmishing troops, which can't take charges, have to flee, but can interpenetrate. Sorry, I'm just reading the push rule. I haven't actually clocked this before. Okay, so you get a modifier to your route test if you're being pushed back by a deeper unit. So there is a benefit to having higher ranks. You get a bonus, or your opponent gets a penalty when they're being pushed back by. Some rules about buildings. Some rules about siege weapon or engines of war machines. Stone throwers, bombards rather than cannon, but same thing. Someone's going to say it's not the same thing, same general effect capability. Chariots. Flying creatures is interesting. Flying creatures take a lot of calculation in 2nd edition because your flyer is either a sweeper, a hoverer or a lander, and on the basis of that it has different movement rates if it's climbing, if it's diving, and what level it's at. So it can be at ground level, attack level, low level and high level. So you have to take note of which type of model it is, what level it's currently on, and whether it's climbing up to the next level, diving to the lower level, or it's staying at the level where it is. That depends how much it can move and what it can target and what can shoot it. There's a lot of stuff here. They've really gone to town on trying to make it immersive with regard to flying things. Some extra psychology things: animosity and instability, poisons, and then we get to the expert rules, beyond the advanced rules, now into the expert rules, and they're talking about campaigns, and here's an example campaign setup. And then what happens to characters and casualties in campaigns. And then we're on to book 2, which is the Battle Magic book. And the way wizards work in 2nd edition is that your wizard has a constitution, which is based on their level. If you so each spell has a particular energy cost. So you would deduct that from your constitution points when you cast it, and then if your constitution is above 12, you automatically cast the spell, and if your constitution is less than 12, you have to roll 2d6, and you're trying to score equal or less than, is that right? Yes, equal to or less than your remaining constitution. And you can rest to regain constitution, but it's very slow, so it's better to save your spells for when you need them rather than throwing them all over the place. We've got battle magic spells, which are all necromantic spells and illusionist spells. These are all this time very much focused, demonic spells, on elemental spells, very much focused on doing stuff on the tabletop. Remember in the last 1st edition we had spells for unlocking doors and that kind of thing. There's none of that here. This is all very much about moving and controlling troops on the battlefields and attacking troops on the battlefield. There's no overtly roleplay things in here. We've got magical weapons and runes and the effect of those, magical artifacts. And then we're on to Battle 3, which is Book 3, which is the Battle Bestiary. So here's your list of creatures. And a discussion of the Warhammer world for the first time, the known world. And this is very overt that the known world is more than a passing resemblance to our own, that exists in a parallel reality. So this is not this world in ancient times, this is this world in a parallel reality. So here's the world map. You can see we've got the Old World, Araby, Lustria, the New World, the Southlands, the Darklands, the Northern Steppes, Cathay, Norta, the Northern and Southern Chaos Wastes, and the Elf Kingdoms, although we've got this little U-shaped place here that's not Ulthuan yet. This is still Elf Kingdoms, and if you have a look actually on the cover, you can see that this is just a fragmented collection of islands. They haven't really firmed up what that means, but it's basically, it's in the position where Atlantis was, right? So they're talking about this being Atlantis here. And it's overt that these places refer to places that exist in our world, but in a parallel dimension version of. And here's a timeline, starting with the Great Ice Age, the appearance of the Slan, the end of the Ice Age, the emergence of the Elves, the emergence of the Amazons, the fall of the Slan, the incursions of Chaos. So you've got the early basis of the Warhammer mythos going on in there. And then a discussion of the various types of creatures, including humans, dwarves, elves, gnomes, goblins, hobgoblins, orcs, lizard men, the Norse, Slan, giants, trolls, very fine Shakinid bone breaker from John Blanche there, very fine model, very fine illustration. Undead creatures, ethereal creatures, and the monsters, including the Great Spined Dragon makes an appearance. Swarms of creatures, demons, elementals. And then some example army lists. This is still very much open to whatever you want to include, but here's some army lists as a guide if you want to create sort of relative forces. So you've got Old World city-states, you've got Goblin Raiders, Chaos Bands, Dark Elf Invasion Forces, Elves, Orcs, Norse Dwarfs, Dwarven Warriors of Karazakarak, Amazonian War Party, Slan Empire. All with not choices to choose from, but these are fixed. You know, it's got this and this and this and this and this, and gives you a total points value at the end. And they're all sort of designed to be reasonably equivalent armies, forces. So that's it for the rule book. Now we're into Ravening Hordes, which is like the first real attempt to give you a system for creating matched forces for tournament play. People talk about Warhammer armies in the 3rd edition being sort of the beginning of the end of free play, but Ravening Hordes did it a bit earlier. It does explain that this is only one way of playing, and the intention is not so much to restrict your forces as to give you something that would resemble, it says here, their factual counterparts. So if these armies existed in the real world, what they would include in them. So sort of limiting your choices as a way of saying, okay, well, there is absolutely no way that this Dark Elf Cold One regiment would be fighting alongside these dwarves. So they're giving you limits to try and make your armies look right in the way that they envisage the world creating and developing. And there are some extra rules in here, and there's a bit of a change in here, which is why I kind of paused earlier on, because I was trying to remember what was in the first section. But there's a bit of a change here to the way that routes and rallying work, in that the free hack is introduced here. So if you rout your opponents, you immediately get to strike at them again. Free hacks, so you don't roll for attack, you just roll to wound. And so that's a way of further whittling down the numbers in the units so that they are then incapable of recovering and continue to rout. So it's another way of having slowed down the combat, maybe of speeding it up again, of declining units a bit faster so that the attacking unit can get back into the battle. There's also stuff in here on fighting challenges. So if you've got champions in units, they can fight on behalf of all unit. And then here are the army lists themselves, so orcs and goblins, orcs, half orcs in fact, and goblins. So you get to choose. Here are your points, here are your options: magicians, orcs, archers, crossbows, savage orc warriors, savage orc archers, half orcs, goblins, goblin archers, javelin men, goblin fanatics hidden in units, snotlings, wolf riders, boar riders, trolls, chariots, war engines, skirmishers, mercenaries, and allies, and your undead. Army lists. Dark Elf army list. Again, I'm sure Forces of Fantasy podcast will go into this in more detail. We're just skipping through quickly. Skaven. And then some particularly fine photographs. A lot of these got reused in 3rd edition, so it'll be very, very familiar to you, I'm sure. Some glorious photographs, full colour, of models fighting alongside the townscapes card buildings that we'll talk about a bit later on, I'm sure. Skaven army list continues. Chaos. Nippon. Norse. The Empire, Dwarfs, Elves, and then ally lists. Small forces that you can take as allies to the central list rather than just having a free choice, so limiting the ally choice as well. And then mercenaries. Then we get a whole host of these scenario bits and pieces. So this is why I've called this volume Plothammer. Starting with the Magnificent Sven, which is the booklet that came with the 2nd edition rules. Another Norse in Lustria campaign. We had Kremlo the Slan before. We've got the Magnificent Sven as a follow-up to that. The Riding, this is a lesser known early scenario pack. Came with a bunch of the cardboard buildings. And basically just talks about particular villages in a particular locality. Gives you some non-player characters. So it ties in very much with like a role-playing background. Gives you some buildings. And that's it, really. Just a background, a basis for some battles. Then the the well-known ones, Bloodbath at Orc's Drift, a scenario pack, gives you a lot more background and information. The Game Master's campaign brief, a bunch of actual scenarios with objectives. Of course, nodding to historical events. I'm sure you can work out which historical events Orc's Drift is nodding to, alluding to. That also came with a bunch of buildings, and then these beautifully coloured, so as to be as illegible as a White Wolf of the era, command sheets. Blue for the orcs. No, blue for the dwarves rather, red for the orcs. Terror of the Lichmaster. Focusing on the events of the Frugalhofen Valley. This is the one that I built
my big wintry terrain board for fighting through a few years ago. I don't know if you'll see that. You've seen that on my blog. Possibly go back to Finn McCall's blog and you'll see those details. But it had all these different locations. You don't need that many figures for it. It's a dozen models aside pretty much most of the way through this campaign. The end battle's a bit bigger, but it's small forces. It really is very few troops. Macbeth. You'll notice that these pages are quite thin and they have a white border. I will confess that these pages are a printout of a PDF, partly because I didn't want to cut up an original scenario booklet for these things. Macbeth obviously based in Scottish stereotype and Shakespearean legend. But also because they're extremely expensive things to get hold of. They were then, I did this about almost 10 years ago, I reckon, and they were expensive and difficult to get hold of then, and they'll be even more so now. So I thought, I don't object to having PDFs of these bits. It's not worth investing in the actual articles to cut them up. But most of the Encyclopaedia Warhammica is original bits. You can see all of these castle floor plans that came with Macbeth. This was a much more involved, even than Orcs Drift, a much more involved campaign, and brought in quite a lot of roleplay elements. Hence again calling this Plothammer, because of the wealth of storyline and the emphasis on fighting through stories in specific cases rather than just fighting battles for the sake of trying to get whatever points. And then we come to the journals, and I had the compendiums in the last edition because the size of the book was smaller. The first edition book was a lot shorter than this, and the compendiums were. I've got the journals in this edition because they're basically A4 size, they're much bigger. But again, the journals, as with the compendiums, they kind of cross over. They're not all the compendiums in first edition, all the journals in second edition. So there's a bit of crossover here, and these are original journals. But there's, as I have discussed going through the rules, there is not a great deal of difference between first and second edition. Certainly in the stat lines you can go with. It's a nice picture of John Blanche there, doing his stuff at his table. Happy retirement, John Blanche, by the way, I should say. After 40 years in the business, you deserve it. Some tips on modelling armour, modelling chainmail. Very much encouraging a kind of DIY approach to modelling, which I like a lot. Some lovely coloured images here, and the drawings of catalogue figures. I haven't marked these, by the way. They were on here when I got the journal. And then I had to get Tony Ackland to design me a shield. So a few years ago at Boyle, Tony Ackland drew me a bloodhound on the shield there. Very nice of him. I was trying to get, there's a t-shirt competition a bit later on, we'll get there, and I was trying to get Wayne England to do that for me, but unfortunately he passed away the year before I was able to come and see him at Boyle, so I did not manage to do that, which is very sad. These are all regiments of renown. If you've been following the White Dwarf, Decades of Dwarf series, you'll have seen some of these pop up therein, and here they are all kind of collected together in one place in the journal. It's a particularly fine looking Richard Halliwell standing next to the Citadel Castle that somebody made, probably they called the Guild, the Gamers Society of the West Midlands or something. They get mentioned quite frequently. And here's yes, a Warhammer monster. The breakdown of Richard Halliwell in your games. Some stuff on card modelling. This is a lot interleaf here. This is a very fine piece of writing here from wonderful Zubaji, who sent me this for the collection. I have the feeling from here that I exchanged some a Southron. I must have exchanged some of the old Lord of the Rings figures, the 80s Lord of the Rings figures with him for this Citadel journal. So this is into the second journal, the wonderful Dolgan Raiders scenario. That was on the map for the first edition, so this was designed for the first edition. So no strict chronology in this book, but you could definitely play it. Definitely play it with second edition. There'd be no problem with that at all. Not so much changed that you couldn't do it. And now we've got pictures. Pictures of washed inked models, replacing the drawings in the previous one. That lovely Trish Morrison's Townsfolk that are so hard to get hold of. And a price list. Fighters 60p, Wizards 60p, Clerics 60p, Thieves 60p. Oh, a Trollers £1.95. I had to include this when I saw that this was still in the middle of the journal because it's just absolutely brilliant. And the Dolgan Raiders deal here, you can get the entire Dolgan Raiders and Hobgoblin Caravan to play the scenario for £60. I guess that would probably be quite 10 pence wheels for the caravans. I guess you're making cardboard caravans and you need to add plastic wheels to them. Yeah, I guess 60 quid would have been quite a lot in 1983, much more than it is these days. But yeah, I still suspect if you did the calculations, you'd be paying more now than you would back then. There you go, there's that Vestments of Vileness without, sadly, a Wayne England t-shirt design on it, but never mind. The results of the Arcane Armorials. Here's the winner with an actual shield made by Raven Armory, who made the Slayer swords. I don't know if they still do, they used to for a long time. Don't even know if they're still going. I think my Tony Ackland shield is much cooler. And here's the map that was used for the front cover here. So actually maybe that does predate the one in the rulebook, because this is the end of first edition, starting to firm up the world, and you've got. You see, yeah, it's interesting. Actually, it must post-date the release of the rulebook, because it's got the Rig Shrine and the Kremlo in here. So Rig Shrine from the previous edition, Kremlo from this edition. Dolgan Raiders takes place up here. Orcs Drift takes place up here. There's no mention of where Macbeth or the Lichmaster come from. Take place, although the Lichmaster is sort of here-ish. Macbeth is sort of here-ish. So yeah, interesting sort of crossover map. Readers Art Gallery, some art sent in by readers. John Blanche talks about using your fingernail as a paint mixing palette. Oh yes, there you go, so your card models for the Dolgan Raiders, and if you want to upgrade your wheels, they're 10 pence a wheel, or 10 pence for a set of wheels. And then here's those cardboard cutouts for fighting the Dolgan Raiders scenario if you don't have the miniatures. Then we're into the next. This is Spring '86, so this is fully into second edition now. When was that actually? Let's go back for interest's sake. The second Citadel Journal is 85, so that does post-date second edition. So we are firmly into second edition here. Vengeance of the Lichmaster, carrying on from the Lichmaster campaign. that wonderful La Maison Tile scenario that we've all talked about and all played at some point, I'm sure, that sees the release of the Skaven, the first instance of the Skaven appearing in Warhammer Fantasy Battle here. Obviously we've had the rules. There weren't any in the rulebook, but Ravening Hordes gave you the army list, and Ravening Hordes, if we go back to it, Ravening Hordes came out in, does it say? This is part of the problem of removing the covers from things, is that you lose a sense of when they came out. Anyway, I would imagine that Ravening Hordes came out after this version of the Citadel Journal that introduces Skaven, because you've got all of the basic rules for using Skaven and their mutations and their magic in the journal here, along with black and white guides on how to paint them, but fortunately some painted, some full colour examples of them being painted. And Caleb Dark makes an appearance. This is actually part 2. Part 1 was in the previous edition. I didn't sort of stop on that one, but this is part 2 of the Caleb Dark, Servant of Malau, of course the fifth and the best Chaos God that got dropped. And this comic strip also did not last very long. It came in the second and the third Citadel Journal. More Vengeance and the Lichmaster stuff, and their recommended figures for the Lichmaster. And then here we are in the 4th Citadel Journal. So this one, let's find a date for this. This is 1987. Can't find a date. Can't find a date. Oh well, never mind. There's the best ever Balrog ever sculpted, although it has wings in this version. Skeleton Horde plastic box gets released. Machineries of Destruction is glorious. Kev Adams sculpts and paint jobs get released. Great Dragons, Nick Bibby Dragons get released. This is a Tony Yates did me this suit of Chaos armour in the Design and Armour Designer Chaos Knight competition. Hooray! So more unique artwork, thank you Tony for doing that. Here's the image of that flying lich horse that's so rare and difficult to get hold of. It's actually, I should turn it this way, look at these beautiful sort of bookcase dioramas that are going on here. Really showcasing the models. If you compare that to the black and white Tony Ackland drawings from the first journal, stuff has moved on really far with regards to showing off all of the stuff, and here those scenario packs. Ravening Hordes, there you go, is out by now. It's out in this edition, so it must have post-dated the previous edition. So there's the contents of your basic Warhammer box. Orcs Drift, Macbeth, Lichmaster, The Riding, Blood on the Streets, Snotting Pump Wagons, pages and pages and pages of cramming as many pictures in as possible. Really beautiful models. More catalogue pages, loads and loads and loads of catalogue pages. And then the final Caleb Dark episode to wrap up the magazine. Dreadaxe drank his fill of their rancid souls. And it goes on, and then Malau's face appears and there is no more, because they released no more journals. The Caleb Dark strip stopped there, went no further. And there we are at the end, and I've got my little reference sheet for second edition on the back there. So hope you enjoyed that whiz through. That's probably been a bit longer than I was intending, but there's a lot of stuff in here and we didn't cover any of it in detail, for which I apologise. But do go and check out the Forces of Fantasy podcast for more detailed analysis. If you're interested in this, if you like what we're doing here, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notifications button, and you'll find out when I'm doing another one. And we're gonna try and whiz through these books fairly quickly so that we can try and get them all done before the end of this year. But who knows? There's a lot to go. But anyway, we're doing well. We're on second edition now. So do join me again for another video. And in the meantime, take care, and I'll see you soon.